Most folks in the valley whispered about the man who lived on the far edge of the grasslands, past the cottonwoods, past the dry creek bed, past the kind of silence that made a rider glance over his shoulder more than once. Some called him a drifter, some called him a loner rancher who wanted no trouble, but everyone agreed on one thing. He kept to himself for reasons nobody in town knew. And for years that mystery kept curious folks away. But on one troubled evening, when the sun dipped low behind the ridge and shadows grew long across the plains, a gang of hard riders pushed toward his land with dust rising behind their horses like a warning no one could ignore. The wind carried the smell of cold iron and dry grass as the gang rode fast, eager to take what they believed was easy pickings. The loner rancher, known only as Hawk, had worked that land alone for months. He had no family that anyone knew of, no hired hands, no partner to watch his back. To the gang, that made him a perfect target. A lonely man on a big spread with a weathered barn, a log cabin, and maybe some cattle tucked away. They thought he had no one to stand for him. They thought he was just another frontier soul, trying to stay alive. What they didn't know was that Hawk had lived through storms that would have crushed another man. He kept scars behind his calm eyes. The kind of scars you don't talk about in town because some histories belong to the land itself. He moved through his days slow and steady, tending to his small herd, mending the fence line, sleeping lightly as if listening for footsteps that had not yet come. Folks said he spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried the quiet strength of a man who had survived things others only heard about in campfire tales on that evening. Hawk was chopping wood behind his cabin when the first tremor of unease settled in his chest. The horses in his corral shifted restlessly. Even the old hound by the porch pushed up from the boards and let out a low growl. Hawk paused. The axe hung in midair. He listened. Then he heard it, faint at first but growing fast, hoofbeats, many of them. The sound rolled through the valley like distant thunder. Trouble was coming, and it was coming hard. Most men would have panicked, rushed inside for a rifle, or run for the safety of the bluff behind the cabin. But Hawk stood still. He knew the land, he knew sound, and he knew the intent behind footsteps. These riders meant harm. He could hear it in the rhythm of their approach. He set the axe gently against the stump, wiped the sweat from his brow, and walked toward the porch with the slow, careful steps of a man who refused to be rattled by the time the gang reached the edge of his property. The sun had slipped low enough that their faces were half hidden in shadow. Their leader, a tall, hard-eyed man named Rigger, pulled his reins tight and looked at the cabin. He thought this would be simple. A quick scare, a fast grab of whatever they wanted, and then they'd ride off toward the red hills before night swallowed the plains. After all, what could one quiet rancher do against a pack of armed men? But the moment Rigger turned his eyes toward the front door, he froze. His men followed his stare. One by one, their horses slowed until the entire gang sat motionless. The porch was plain, the door worn, but carved into the wood with clean, sharp strokes was a mark none of them expected to see. A symbol older than any of their troubles, a sign tied to stories whispered in every saloon from Montana to New Mexico. A Cherokee mark. A warning mark. The gang shifted uneasily in their saddles. The wind lifted the dust at their feet. Even the horses seemed to sense something was wrong. One rider muttered that this wasn't worth it. Another cursed under his breath. A third asked why a quiet rancher in the middle of nowhere would dare to place such a powerful symbol on his door. Rigger didn't answer. He kept staring at the mark like it had reached up from the wood and grabbed him by the throat. Hawk stepped onto the porch, then, calm as a creek at dawn. His shoulders broad, his gaze steady. He didn't raise a weapon. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, the fading sunlight casting a long line of gold across his face. The gang watched him carefully, unsure if they should fear the man or the mark behind him. Rigger narrowed his eyes. He didn't like mysteries, and he didn't like being unsure. He forced his voice steady and called out, asking why a rancher living so far from tribal grounds carried the Cherokee sign on his cabin door. Hawk didn't blink. He didn't move. He spoke with a low, steady voice that carried across the quiet land. He said he placed the mark for a reason, and that reason wasn't anyone's business but his own. His tone wasn't sharp or threatening. It was simple truth spoken by a man who knew exactly what line he was drawing. The gang shifted again, dust swirling around them like restless spirits. Some of the riders glanced toward the open plains, tempted to turn back before something they didn't understand swallowed them whole. But pride is a dangerous thing, and Rigger, full of it, refused to let symbols or silent men shake him. He smirked, called Hawk a fool for using tribal signs as scare tactics, and nudged his horse closer, yet the moment he approached the porch, Hawk's hound growled deep, a warning that sent a ripple of fear through the gang. Hawk didn't look down at the dog. He only watched Rigger with eyes that held too much history for a simple rancher. Rigger felt that stare. Felt it colder than the evening wind creeping down the ridge. The other riders whispered among themselves. Some insisted the mark meant Hawk had ties to the Cherokee. Others argued no tribe would stand for one man so far from their territory. A few spoke of old stories. Tales of warriors who carved such marks on doors only when they meant to warn others of danger far greater than theft or trespass. The tension thickened until even the quiet air felt heavy. Rigger pulled his shoulders back and shouted that he didn't care about the symbol, the stories, or the man standing before him. He wanted supplies, maybe cattle, and he was willing to take them. As he dismounted, ready to push forward and prove his dominance, the gang suddenly fell silent. Not because of what Rigger said, but because something else caught their eye. From the woods behind the ranch, a faint sound drifted toward them. Soft at first, then clearer. The sound of a single drumbeat, slow, deep, rhythmic like a heart pounding through the earth. The gang whipped their heads toward the trees. The drumbeat came again, then again, then once more. Hawk didn't move. Rigger went pale. No one could see who was in the woods. No one could see how many. No one could see whether they were friend or foe. The only thing certain was that the drumbeat wasn't a coincidence. And it wasn't distant. It was close, too close. The gang looked at Hawk, waiting for some explanation, but he gave none. He simply stood tall on his porch, the Cherokee mark behind him, the drumbeat echoing across the land, and the fear settling deep into the bones of every rider who dared to challenge him. And as the wind picked up, carrying the sound across the valley, every man there realized one truth they should have known. Before riding out, the loner rancher was not alone. Not tonight. Not ever. And the moment the next drumbeat struck the air, louder than before, the gang understood they had already crossed a line they should never have touched. But by then it was too late. The drumbeat rolled across the plains again, slower this time, as if whoever was behind the sound wanted every man on that land to feel it in his chest. Hawk stood still on the porch, the fading light brushing his shoulders in a warm gold that didn't match the cold chill sliding through the riders facing him. The gang shifted, glancing at one another, their confidence draining like water through cracked boards. Even the horses sensed the unease and stepped back, snorting as if something unseen pressed against them. Rigger clenched his jaw, trying to steady his nerves. Men like him built their reputations on fear, and he wasn't about to let a drumbeat or a carving on a door undo his control. But he couldn't hide the way his hand trembled when he grabbed his reins. He told himself it was just the cold wind. Yet the truth sank hard inside him. Something about Hawk wasn't right, something didn't fit. No lone rancher lived with that kind of calm in the face of danger. The drumbeat sounded again. A long pause followed. The woods behind the ranch held their breath, waiting. The gang stared at the tree line, wondering if they should draw their weapons or turn their horses around and forget this ride ever happened. But pride kept them frozen in place. Hawk finally spoke, his tone quiet but carrying across the open space. He told Rigger and his men that they had stepped onto land that wasn't meant for thieves or bullies. His voice held no anger, just certainty. The kind of certainty that came from a life shaped by experiences no ordinary rancher endured. Rigger barked back, asking what kind of game Hawk thought he was playing and who in the woods was beating that drum. Hawk didn't answer. He kept his gaze steady, almost thoughtful, like a man choosing his words with care. He told Rigger that not every story needed explaining and that some marks carved into doors were not for decoration. They were reminders of promises made long before the gang ever considered writing this way. One of the writers, a younger man named Dolan, whispered a warning to Rigger. He said he'd heard tales of men who carried tribal ties and weren't to be crossed. He'd heard whispers about warriors who traveled alone but were never truly alone. Rigger snarled at him to stay quiet. But the seed of fear was planted deep, and the other riders felt it too. The drumbeat faded into silence. But the tension stayed, thick and unmoving. Rigger tried to regain control. He dismounted and stepped toward the porch, his boots crunching on dry earth. Hawk didn't step back. He didn't lift a hand or show a weapon. He only watched Rigger with a calm that made the gang leader hesitate mid-step. The silence between them held the weight of unspoken histories. And though Rigger tried to hide, the mark on the door bothered him more than anything else. He'd seen it once before, years ago, during a cattle drive that went wrong near the mountains. Men back then said the mark was placed only by those with Cherokee blood or warriors, who earned trust through something deeper than kinship. Rigger swallowed hard and finally demanded to know why Hawk bore the symbol. The loner rancher didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past the gang toward the open plains stretching into the dying light. Then he spoke in a tone that carried more truth than explanation. He said some roads a man walks lead him into, places others cannot follow, and that certain bonds formed in those places never faded. The gang didn't understand those words, but they felt them, and that unease only deepened when Hawk mentioned that long before he settled on this land, he had lived through storms that forced him to choose sides in a world where choices carried heavy prices. Every man in the gang felt a cold twist inside hearing that, though none of them understood what storms he meant, the sun dipped lower, shadows crawling across the ranch. The wind shifted, brushing through the grass with a soft whisper, as if the land itself listened. Rigger stepped closer, trying to shake the fear creeping up his spine. He accused Hawk of hiding something valuable, claiming that no man put a mark like that on his door unless he had something worth protecting. Hawk didn't react. He simply told Rigger that what he protected wasn't something a gang of riders could steal. Rigger scoffed, but deep down he felt the truth in those words. Something about Hawk didn't match the life of a simple rancher. His posture, his silence, the calm steadiness in his eyes, and the weight of the mark carved into his door hinted at stories far older than the cabin or the land beneath it. Meanwhile, Dolan looked again toward the trees. He felt something watching them. He felt eyes that were not Hawk's. The silence from the woods was too deep, too heavy, too aware. He nudged the rider next to him and whispered his worry. The rider nodded nervously. Neither wanted to admit it out loud, but they felt as if the woods held more than trees now. Rigger pushed forward, determined to prove dominance. He told Hawk they were taking supplies whether he liked it or not. He warned him that one man couldn't stand against a gang like his. Hawk only lifted his chin slightly and said he never expected to stand alone. The gang fell still. Rigger narrowed his eyes, unsure if Hawk meant allies or something else entirely. The air thickened again, as if the land waited for the next move. Hawk's gaze drifted toward the door, toward the carved Cherokee mark that glowed faintly in the low light. Then he looked back at Rigger and said that some promises bind deeper than blood and last longer than time. Rigger spat at the ground, frustrated by Hawk's calm and the unease growing between his men. He stepped closer, close enough now that Hawk could have struck him if he wanted, but he didn't. Instead, Hawk told Rigger that if he crossed the porch, he would step into something he did not understand. Rigger laughed a harsh, forced laugh, but it didn't reach his eyes. He raised his hand as if signaling the gang to move forward. Before he could wave them in, the drumbeat returned. This time faster, harder, it echoed through the woods like warning thunder. The horses panicked, stomping and pulling at their reins. Riders shouted. The ground under them seemed to vibrate with a pulse that didn't belong to the land alone. Rigger spun toward the sound, his bravado slipping. The drumbeat grew louder, almost urgent, as if someone in the woods had decided patience was at its end. The air pulsed with the rhythm, and the gang felt it in their bones. Hawk didn't look toward the woods. He kept his eyes on the gang, watching their fear rise. He told them they had pushed their luck far enough. He told them some places were meant to be respected and some men were meant to be left in peace. His voice carried no threat, but every man there heard the warning inside it. Rigger hesitated. His men weren't steady anymore. They looked ready to flee. But pride clawed at him, and he couldn't retreat without losing face. He shouted that he didn't care who hid in the woods. He didn't care about old symbols or quiet men or ancient promises. He shouted that he would take what he wanted. Then the drumbeat stopped. The woods went silent. Every man felt the sudden stillness like an icy hand gripping the air. Something in that silence was worse than the sound itself. Something final. The riders looked into the trees, searching for movement, a shadow, anything. But the woods stared back with dark, unblinking calm. Hawk finally stepped off the porch. His boots sank lightly into the dry earth. The gang stiffened, unsure what he would do. Hawk didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he walked past Rigger, slow and steady. As if nothing in the world frightened him, he stopped at the edge of the yard and looked toward the forest. For a brief moment, the fading light caught the side of his face, revealing marks that ran across his skin, faint but unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were. Rigger's eyes widened when he saw them. So did the rest of the gang. They weren't simple scars. They looked like tribal marks. And then Hawk did something none of them expected. He raised his right hand with quiet respect, palm open toward the trees. Someone in the woods answered with a single sharp drum beat. The gang froze where they sat. The last light bled out of the sky. And the truth settled. In cold and heavy, Hawk wasn't signaling for help. He was being acknowledged. By someone watching. By someone close. By someone the gang should never have crossed. And as darkness finally swallowed the plains, the riders understood one thing with terrifying clarity. They were not alone on this land, and whatever waited in the woods had just decided the night wasn't going to end in their favor. Night settled fast across the valley, deeper and thicker than the riders expected. The last thread of daylight vanished behind the ridge, leaving only a faint red glow staining the sky like a dying ember. The gang sat unsettled, shifting in their saddles, glancing toward the dark woods where the drumbeat had come from. None of them wanted to admit it out loud, but fear hung heavy in the air. Rigger tried to control his breathing. He had led his men through storms, gunfights, and frontier troubles without flinching, but this night gnawed at him in a way no bullet ever had. Something about the stillness, about the way Hawk stood with his hand raised toward the trees, made Rigger feel smaller than he ever believed he could feel. Hawk lowered his hand slowly. He didn't turn toward the gang. Instead, he looked over the land like a man listening for a voice only he could hear. The wind shifted, brushing his hair back, carrying the scent of pine and dust across the yard. The old hound on the porch paced and whined softly, ears flat, as if sensing something the men couldn't see. The silence stretched too long. Rigger finally snapped, demanding to know who was in the woods. He wanted names, answers, something he could grab hold of to steady his thoughts. Hawk didn't give him any. Instead, he stepped back toward the porch and told Rigger that some things weren't meant to be spoken in the dark, and some questions brought answers a man never wanted. Dolan, the youngest in the gang, swallowed hard. His voice shook as he asked Hawk why the tribe would send someone to a rancher living alone on the edge of the plains. Hawk paused, then told him that tribe ties ran deeper than landlines and deeper than blood. Sometimes they ran through debts, vows, and promises carved into the very soul of a man. Rigger scoffed at that, though the sound betrayed his unease. He accused Hawk of bluffing, claiming the mark on the door and the drumbeat were just tricks to scare off intruders. But even he didn't believe his own words. Not with the woods so silent. Not with the tension thick enough to choke on, the gang whispered among themselves. One rider, a broad-shouldered man named Crail, muttered that they should turn back. Nothing on this ranch was worth facing things hidden in the woods. But Rigger barked at him to stay put. He wasn't about to turn tail and let fear control him. He had a reputation to keep and men to command. Hawk stepped onto the first porch plank, the wood creaking under his weight. His voice stayed calm as he told Rigger he was making a mistake. That pushing into a man's home, especially a home carrying a Cherokee warning, was crossing a line that never ended well. But Rigger spat at the ground again. He didn't believe in warnings, not from men, not from tribes, and not from shadows in the woods. Still, he noticed something else. Hawk's left shoulder carried a faint movement like he was favoring it. And when the moon rose weakly behind a cloud, a thin scar caught the faint light. It wasn't a simple scar. It curved in patterns Rigger had seen only once before on a warrior during a cattle drive gone wrong. Warriors carried their stories on their skin. Hawk's story was written there, quiet and hidden, but powerful. The wind grew colder. Dolan's horse stomped nervously and refused to stay still. Crail muttered that something was coming. The other riders turned to the woods again, but nothing moved. That stillness made everything worse. Finally, Hawk spoke again, this time slower. He told Rigger he didn't want trouble, that he'd lived on this land to keep peace, not to stir it. But peace wasn't something men like Rigger respected. Rigger snarled and said no quiet man could scare him. He stepped forward and ordered the gang to spread around the cabin and check the barn. The moment he gave that command, Hawk's eyes hardened. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, something old. A shift in a man who had been trying to avoid a fight he knew too well. Then from the woods came no drum, no sound, no whisper. Only a presence. Something unseen but felt. The kind of presence that made the land feel smaller, like the trees closed in without moving. Rigger didn't care. He waved his arm, sending 2 riders toward the barn. They kicked their horses reluctantly and rode across the yard with stiff shoulders. The barn loomed large in the moonlight, its boards dark from weather and time. The riders stopped before going in, glancing back at Rigger for reassurance. He yelled at them to move. They swallowed fear and pushed inside. Hawk didn't turn to look, but his jaw tightened. His hound growled again, louder this time, staring at the barn with thick fur lifting along its back. Hawk lifted his voice and told Rigger he should call his men back. Rigger ignored him. Moments passed. Too many, too long. Then a sound erupted from the barn. Not a scream, not a shout, a heavy crash. Then silence again. The riders outside stiffened. Rigger cursed under his breath and shouted for the men to answer. No voice came back. The barn door swayed slightly like something had brushed against it. The horses in the yard neighed and backed away, refusing to stand still. Dolan started shaking. He said they had no business being here, that this wasn't normal trouble. Rigger grabbed him by the collar and threatened him if he didn't hold steady. But even Rigger's voice was cracking now. He was losing control, and every man knew it. The moon slipped behind another cloud. The land dimmed further. Shadows thickened. Hawk took a slow breath, then said that whatever the gang believed they were after wasn't worth the danger now circling around them. He told them once again to leave before the night grew heavier. Rigger didn't answer right away. His pride battled his fear, locked in a struggle he couldn't hide. Finally, he spat to the side and told Hawk that if he stepped off the porch again, he would shoot. Hawk didn't flinch. The gang saw that. His calm was unnerving. Then Hawk did something that caught them off guard. He didn't back down. He didn't argue. He simply stepped down the last porch plank, boots firm on the dirt, and walked past Rigger again. This time toward the barn. Rigger yelled at him to stop, but Hawk kept walking steadily. His silhouette cut through the moonlight like a man facing a fate he'd known was coming. The wind picked up around him, swirling dust across the yard. The gang watched, frozen, as Hawk moved closer to the barn door. He stopped a few paces away, studying the shadows inside. The riders behind him fidgeted, unsure if they should draw their weapons or retreat. Hawk lifted his voice just enough for them to hear. He said he knew what waited there. He said he had hoped it wouldn't come to this. He said some debts followed a man no matter how far he ran from them. Rigger snapped, demanding to know what he meant. Hawk didn't answer. He pushed the barn door fully open and stepped inside. The gang held their breath. Inside the barn, the darkness felt heavy, thick as smoke. Hawk's figure disappeared into it. The gang strained their ears, waiting for something, anything. A moment later, a faint sound drifted out. Not a struggle. Not violence. Something stranger. Like a voice speaking low, in a language none of the riders understood. Rigger's face drained of color. The gang whispered among themselves again. They spoke of old stories, tales of men marked by tribes, men who carried vows that didn't break. Men like Hawk. Minutes dragged. The wind brushed the trees in the distance, and every rustle felt like a warning. Crail finally backed his horse away, saying he didn't sign up for this. Dolan followed suit, his hands shaking too hard to hold the reins. Rigger tried to hold them together, but fear eroded his authority faster than he could rebuild it. He shouted at them to stay, but his voice didn't carry its old weight. Then, Hawk stepped back into the moonlight. The gang froze. Something about him was different now. His expression, darker, older, like stepping into the barn, had awakened a part of him long buried. He looked at the riders, then at Rigger, and said only one thing: "You should never have come here." His voice wasn't threatening. It was truth. And behind him, in the barn, something moved in the shadows, something none of the riders could see. Clearly, something not alone. The horses screamed. The wind died, and the night closed in tight around them, ready to reveal what the gang had awakened. But not yet. Not fully, not until it was far too late. The horses fought their reins harder now, stamping deep into the dirt as if trying to dig their way out of the moment. The wind had died so completely that every breath sounded louder than normal, like the night was leaning in to listen. Rigger sat stiff in his saddle, trying to pretend he didn't see the unease in his own men, but the truth hung plain on his face. Even he didn't know what Hawk had awakened inside that barn. Hawk stepped further from the shadows behind him, yet he didn't look like a man preparing for a fight. He looked like someone who already knew what the night would bring, someone who carried the weight of too many storms in his chest. His voice, when he spoke, didn't carry anger or threat. It carried something heavier, something that made the gang question whether they had stepped into the kind of trouble they couldn't back away from. He told Rigger and the others that the barn held something they wouldn't understand. A history, a promise, a past he never meant for anyone on this land to disturb again. But Rigger barked out a shaky laugh, masked with bravado, saying no man kept something inside a barn that could scare him. He tried to raise his voice like he was in control, but it faltered, thin and cracked. Hawk didn't look at Rigger. Instead, he fixed his gaze on the woods behind the barn, where the drumbeat had come from earlier. A faint shift in the trees caught the attention of the gang. A branch moved, then another. No wind stirred them. Something was moving through the forest, coming closer, slow and deliberate. The riders murmured, their fear rising again. Dolan whispered that the forest felt alive. Crail muttered that he had never seen trees move like that without wind pushing them. The others stared silently, hoping the darkness was tricking their eyes. Rigger gripped the handle of his revolver tighter. His voice wavered as he demanded to know what came from the woods. Hawk answered that he didn't call them, but they came anyway, drawn by the mark on the door and the drumbeat in the air. He said the night was older than the men standing in it, and tonight it wanted acknowledgement that only stirred the riders' fear more. They looked around as if expecting shadows to pull them from their saddles. The horses continued to whine, heads tossing from side to side, eyes wide with instinctive terror. Rigger, desperate to keep control, snapped his fingers at two riders and ordered them to circle behind the cabin. They hesitated, but Rigger's anger pushed them forward. As they disappeared around the corner, the rest of the gang watched the tree line like prey waiting for the first strike. Minutes crawled by. Too quiet, too dark. Then the riders who moved behind the cabin shouted something. The gang jerked their heads toward the sound. One voice rose in panic. Then another. Then silence. The gang stiffened. Rigger tried to call out their names, but no one answered. Hawk lowered his head slightly, as if mourning something only he understood. Dolan's voice cracked when he whispered if those men were alive. Hawk didn't answer. That silence was an answer of its own. The tension reached deeper. The gang began to see the truth they'd been ignoring. Whatever surrounded this ranch was not something they could fight with bullets or strong voices. And Hawk, with his calm stance and deep-marked past, wasn't someone they ever should have challenged. Rigger tried to steady his horse, but the animal kept backing up, hooves sliding in the dust. He shouted at Hawk to explain what was in that barn, what waited in the woods, what was moving around the cabin. But Hawk only shook his head. He said some truths brought more trouble when spoken aloud. And he didn't need to tell Rigger anything. The night would speak for itself. The woods shifted again, closer now. The riders' breaths grew loud and uneven. Even Crail, who tried to act tough, looked ready to collapse. The cold in the air deepened, settling into bones like winter frost. Hawk turned his head just slightly, listening. Then he told the gang they still had time to leave. That the line they crossed could still be stepped back over if they left now. But Rigger wasn't ready to back down. Pride tightened around him like iron. His voice cracked as he shouted that he didn't fear stories. Tribes, shadows, or the quiet man standing on the ranch. But the moment he raised his voice, a new sound came from the woods. Not a drum. Not a voice. A sharp, deliberate crack of wood. Then another. As if something heavy was stepping between the trees, the riders' horses reared, pulling so hard the leather reins burned the men's hands. One horse broke loose entirely and sprinted into the open plains with a panicked scream. The gang stared helplessly as its silhouette vanished into darkness. Rigger's men were breaking. He knew it, but he still couldn't accept it. He yelled that they came for supplies and they would leave with them. His voice shook so hard even he heard the fear inside it. Hawk stepped forward again, steady as ever. He told Rigger that men who took what wasn't theirs always met the weight of their actions. He said respect kept peace on the frontier, and disrespect woke things better left sleeping. Rigger reached for his gun. His hand trembled. Dolan watched him with wide eyes, whispering that drawing a weapon now would only make things worse. Rigger ignored him. Before he could lift the revolver, a shadow moved behind Hawk, just inside the barn. A figure stepped into the moonlight, tall, silent. The air thickened around it. The riders stiffened, hands frozen on reins. Only Hawk stood calm, as if he expected it. The figure didn't step out fully. It stayed at the threshold, half in darkness, half in the pale glow of the moon. Its presence alone sent a wave of cold through the yard. Crail muttered something about curses. Another rider whispered prayers under his breath. Rigger lowered his gun slowly, unable to hide the fear climbing up his spine. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. Hawk stepped to the side, allowing the gang a clear view. Not of the figure's face, but of what hung around its neck. A woven strand of beads carved with tribal marks. Marks the riders recognized only from stories. Cherokee marks. Marks worn only by protectors, never wanderers. The riders froze. Every muscle locked. Even Rigger stopped breathing for a heartbeat. Hawk didn't introduce the figure. He didn't explain. He simply said the bond forged years ago still held its ground. And the people who honored that bond answered when called, whether by drum, mark, or memory. Rigger finally spoke, his voice barely audible. He said he didn't come to start a war. Hawk nodded, but told him he didn't get to choose how the night judged his intentions. He only got to choose whether he walked away or stayed and let fate decide. The noise in the woods grew louder. Whatever moved through the trees was almost at the edge of the yard now. Branches spread. Leaves rustled. The gang turned as one, eyes wide, breath shallow. Fear pulsed through them like blood. The figure in the barn stepped forward again. Not fully. Just enough that the markings on its arms flashed beneath the moonlight. Rigger saw them clearly now. Patterns carved with meaning. Stories etched into skin. The gang realized Hawk was not the only man marked. Hawk took a slow breath and said the night wouldn't wait much longer for a choice. Leave now, and the woods would let them pass. Stay, and the moment they feared most would arrive. Rigger stared at him, torn between pride and survival. The other riders looked only toward the woods, where the shapes moved just out of sight. Then, from the darkness, a faint voice drifted through the trees, soft, controlled, but powerful. It spoke in Cherokee. Even the horses, froze, Rigger's eyes went wide, and Hawk turned toward the sound. Recognizing it instantly, the voice called his name, not a warning, not a threat, a summons, Rigger whispered in dread, asking what that meant. Hawk didn't turn to him. He only said the words that made the riders' hearts drop to their boots. It means the night has chosen its moment. The woods stirred violently. The figure in the barn lifted its head, and Hawk stepped forward, ready to face the storm that had finally arrived, but the storm had not yet revealed its teeth. Not yet, not until the night reached its darkest point. The moment the voice called Hawk's name from the woods, everything on the ranch seemed to hold its breath. The gang sat frozen on their saddles, unable to tear their eyes from the tree line. Even Rigger, rattled to his core, struggled to understand what force he had stepped against. The night had built to its sharpest edge. But now something shifted, not harsh or violent, but steady. Like a river finally revealing where it flowed, Hawk stepped forward slowly, with the calm of a man who had been waiting for this moment longer than anyone realized. The figure in the barn straightened, its shoulders carrying ancient pride. The woods stirred again, but not with threat now. The rustling softened like branches moving aside in respect. A second silhouette appeared between the trees. Tall, strong, wrapped in buckskin, stitched with tribal patterns that glinted under the moonlight. Rigger's men gasped quietly. Hawk stopped halfway across the yard, his eyes fixed on the approaching figure. For the first time since the gang arrived, emotion flickered across his face. Something deep, something long, carried. The rider emerging from the woods held no weapon in hand. Only a carved staff marked with symbols that matched the one on Hawk's door. As the figure stepped fully into the moonlight, the gang finally saw the truth. It was a Cherokee elder, face lined with years, but steady as the land. His presence calmed the air, calming everything that trembled around it. Hawk lowered his head with deep respect. The elder lifted a hand in acknowledgement, then spoke softly in Cherokee. The words carried across the yard like warm smoke from a winter fire. Though the gang didn't understand the language, they understood the meaning. The elder wasn't here to threaten. He was here to guide. Rigger swallowed hard. He finally realized that Hawk wasn't a lone rancher hiding from the world. He was a man tied to something larger than anyone had seen. Something honorable. Something old as the valleys. The elder turned to the barn, and the figure inside stepped closer. A woman emerged now, strong and graceful, with the same tribal marks running along her arms. She moved to the elder's side, her eyes glowing with fierce loyalty. Hawk's breath caught. Dolan whispered that he had never seen such presence from anyone before. The woman looked at Hawk with a soft smile. She said his name in a gentle tone, a mix of memory and relief. Hawk smiled back, a rare and quiet expression that seemed to ease the tension in the night. She told him in a steady voice that the tribe had been seeking him for months, but the trail had faded until the drumbeats returned through the valley, calling them home. Rigger blinked in confusion. He asked what any of this meant. Hawk turned his gaze to him, no anger in his voice, only truth. He explained that years ago, when storms of conflict swept across the plains and borders between communities grew sharp, he found shelter and purpose among the Cherokee. He earned their trust and gave his own in return. When peace was restored, Hawk left not because he was unwelcome, but because he carried a task he needed to complete alone. A promise to protect and honor the land he now lived on. A quiet duty to uphold. The elder nodded and added that Hawk carried a bond that could not be broken by distance. The mark on his door symbolized that he was one of their own, in heart if not in blood, and that anyone who threatened him would answer to more than the man standing in the yard. The gang listened in stunned silence. The fear that had knotted their stomachs loosened, replaced by a heavy shame. They had ridden in with greed, thinking Hawk was alone. They now saw they had stepped into a circle much larger than their pride could handle. Rigger lowered his head. His shoulders sagged. The swagger and fury he carried were gone. He told Hawk quietly that he had been wrong, and that he never meant to stir a storm this big. Hawk believed him. Even the elder watched Rigger with a thoughtful gaze. Neither condemning nor punishing, Hawk stepped closer to Rigger, not in anger, but in honesty. He said the plains had a rule older than any town law. A rule that said a man must walk with respect, because the land remembered every step. Rigger nodded, gaze fixed on the dirt, understanding the weight of that truth. Dolan whispered that they should leave, that they had crossed a line no outlaw should ever cross. Rigger agreed. He apologized again, this time not just to Hawk, but to the Cherokee watchers who now stood calm and silent around the yard. The elder gave a nod of acceptance. The woman in the barn softened her expression. The gang turned their horses slowly, careful not to disturb the quiet moment. One by one, they rode away from the ranch, their shadows stretching long across the plains as if the land itself was escorting them out. There was no gunfight, no violence, no final stand. Just understanding and a deep lesson learned. When the last rider disappeared into the darkness, the ranch felt different. Lighter, as if a long weight had been taken off its shoulders. Hawk let out a slow breath and turned toward the elder and the woman emerging from the barn. The woman stepped closer, her eyes warm. She touched Hawk's arm gently, tracing the patterns there. She told him the tribe had always known he carried a quiet heart, strong enough to stand alone when needed, but never meant to remain alone forever. The elder nodded, adding that the night had brought them back to him so he could walk forward again with balance. Hawk looked around his ranch, seeing it anew. The quiet cabin, the weathered barn, the wind brushing the grass. He realized he had built his life here out of both solitude and duty. But now, with the tribe returning and the past reconnecting, he felt something open inside him. Something hopeful. The woman smiled and asked if she and the elder could stay for a while, help rebuild and strengthen the land Hawk had protected. Hawk nodded, grateful. The thought of companionship, of shared work and shared stories, filled the ranch with a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. As they walked toward the porch together, Hawk turned to the elder and asked how they knew to come tonight. The elder tapped his staff lightly on the ground. He said the earth carried whispers, and when danger came close to one of their own, the land itself sent signs, guiding those who listened. Hawk glanced at the woods, the barn, and the Cherokee mark carved on his door. He realized that the ties he thought he had outgrown had never left him. They had simply waited until he needed them most. The night air softened now, no longer heavy with threat. The horses in the corral calmed, the old hound wagged its tail, and the quiet around the ranch felt peaceful instead of eerie. The tribe's presence brought not fear, but balance, strength. Home. As the elder settled near the porch and the woman began tending to the fire pit, Hawk knew something had changed in him. The ranch no longer felt like a place he carried alone. It felt like the beginning of something new, something shared. And when dawn crept over the plains hours later, warm light spilling across the land, Hawk stood with the woman by the fence line, watching the sunrise. She smiled at him, and he smiled back in a way he hadn't in a long time. The danger was gone. The night had passed. The Cherokee bond that shaped his past now shaped his future. Peace returned to the valley, and the ranch wasn't lonely ground anymore. It was home, a place of promise, a place where trouble had come and been turned away by unity, honor, and the strength of people who protected their own. And Hawk, the man once thought to be a quiet loner, now stood ready for whatever new paths the sunrise brought with it.